What approach would help us better understand the origin, characteristics, and meaning of Stalinism? According to Arendt, the obsession with the objective enemy had driven Stalinist totalitarianism to always search for new objectives for their repressive apparatus. After the descendants of the old ruling classes, it's the kulaks' turn, then the traitors within the party, the Volga Germans, etc. 782. To comprehend the futility of this formula, all that's required is to reflect on the fact that it could easily be applied to the history of the United States. At the end of the 19th century, the United States participates in the celebration of the community of Germanic nations and races as the vanguard of civilization. In the decades following its intervention in the First World War, the Germans become the enemy par excellence. It's the period of the Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union. However, after the Third Reich's overthrow, the USSR becomes the enemy par excellence. Thus Americans of German are no longer the subject of persecution. Instead, it's those Americans suspected of sympathizing with communism. Yet in the last stage of the Cold War, Washington makes use of both China's collaboration and the Islamic freedom fighters who sustain the anti-Soviet resistance in Afghanistan. But with the defeat of the evil empire, it's the former allies who represent the new incarnation of evil. The freedom fighters are sent off to Guantanamo. There's one detail that reveals the weakness of Arendt's formula, the formula that blames the obsession with the objective enemy for the deportations of the Volga Germans during the Second World War. In reality, similar measures had been taken in 1915 by Tsarist Russia, at that time allied to the liberal West. Also immediately after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt acts in a similar way toward the objective enemy, represented this time by American citizens of Japanese origin. If you want to take into consideration the geographic and military situation, the concern of the Soviet dictator appears more justified than that of the American president. Every so often, Arendt appears to realize the problematic nature of the category that she uses. The first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism denounces the obsession with a potential enemy, but for as long as the Second 30 Years' War lasts, the Soviet people see themselves threatened by a mortal threat. Being on the alert for a potential enemy could hardly be considered an expression of paranoia. The subsequent editions of the book then prefer to speak of the objective enemy, thus accentuating the psychological character of a behavior that continues to be attributed exclusively to totalitarian dictators. 783 But this linguistic alternation doesn't at all change the terms of the problem. Despite unhesitatingly opposing Nazi Germany and sympathizing with the land of the Third Republic and the Great Revolution, at the moment of the Second World War's outbreak Arendt suffered imprisonment in France in a concentration camp, and in the last analysis had suffered that fate of being a potential enemy or objective enemy. We'll soon see that this category is also at work in Churchill's Britain and in F.D. Roosevelt's United States. Unfortunately, Arendt operates on a purely ideological level, without even raising the problem of a comparative analysis of the policies pursued by the leadership groups of different countries in situations of severe crisis. It would be beneficial to fill this gap. After the conclusion of the Second World War, Churchill offers this summary of the situation at the time of the lead-up to the gigantic military clash. It was known at that time that there were 20,000 organized Nazis in Britain, an acute danger of sabotage and crime. As a prelude to the outbreak of war, it would align with the procedure already applied in other friendly countries. 784 That's how the statesman justified the policy pursued by him during the conflict, when all those suspected of sympathizing with the enemy or their political system could be arrested. To sympathize was the all-inclusive term that allowed the government to arrest without trial, and for an undetermined amount of time, members not just of fascist organizations but also any group considered by the Interior Minister to be sympathetic to the Germans, including those that supported negotiations with Hitler. 785 Those persecuted are not responsible for deliberate and concrete actions, but are rather potential or objective enemies. Protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific, as well as by a powerful navy, the U.S. ought not to feel particularly threatened. But F.D. Roosevelt warns, the enemy is not discouraged by the ocean. It's necessary to take note of the lesson from Norway, whose principal ports were captured thanks to a surprise treason prepared over a number of years. A similar threat looms over the American continent. Quote, "The first phase of the invasion of this hemisphere won't be the landing of regular troops. The strategic and essential ports will be occupied by secret agents, by useful idiots at their service, and there are many of those here and in Latin America. So long as the aggressive nations maintain the offensive, it will be them and not us who choose the time, place, and method of their attack." 786 unquote. And that's not all. It's also necessary to confront the aggression carried out by means of the secret diffusion of toxic propaganda by those who seek to destroy unity and promote division. It's at this point that traitors or objective enemies tend to be those that already express opinions considered to be in opposition to the national interest, and resistance becomes a task that should be realized not only by the army but by the entire country. Both must demonstrate an unbreakable unity. Quote, "Those who are on our lines of defense and those in the rear who build these lines must have the energy and courage that arises out of an unbreakable faith in the way of life that they defend. The powerful action that we are calling for can't be based on disrespect with regard to those things that we are fighting for." 787 unquote. To eliminate an omnipresent threat, that also makes its presence felt at the political level, requires a total mobilization that ends up affecting the political sphere as well. Starting on that basis they develop a well-orchestrated media campaign. 788 When will Hitler invade the U.S., a manifesto asks, with the image of Nazi paratroopers landing over undefended American cities, which are also vulnerable. A second manifesto insists, to a landing by sea. Even more serious is the dangerous fact that Hitler's army is already here. At least that is what a third manifesto thinks. It warns against the fifth column in the United States. 789 Films and books that call attention to the seriousness of this threat achieve great success, while the committee that tracks anti-American activities calculates exactly 480,000 supporters of organizations ready to assist the invaders. 790 And just like in Britain, in the United States the category of enemy agent or accomplice is also expanded to include even all those who seek to prevent the country's involvement or entry into the war. 791 They are accused of being the Nazis' transmission belt, the Third Reich's Trojan horse, or to cite the very words of F.D. Roosevelt, the fifth column of appeasement. This last phrase is especially significant. What becomes synonymous with treason is a political outlook, and just for that those that embrace it became targets of denunciation, trials and intimidation. They are considered, in the last analysis, to be potential or objective enemies. A climate of fear and suspicion spreads across the country, quickly exploited by the authorities to increase the powers of the FBI. 792 The President reveals to the press that pro-German elements have infiltrated the Army and Navy and have organized or tried to organize sabotage operations at 40 or 50 factories across the country. Even a balanced intellectual like William L. Shirer encourages everyone to prepare, with war round the corner, to confront the sabotage carried out by thousands of Nazi agents from coast to coast. Everywhere they suspect or are on the lookout for the enemy's actions. The fifth column carried out a fundamental role at times, weakening Belgium and France from within, and now, so the argument goes, the Nazi termites are operating inside the American Republic as well, which runs the risk of suffering the same fate. 793 Apparently there are some attempts on the part of the Third Reich's agents to encourage or take advantage of worker discontent in the factories and to obstruct the production of munitions for the Allies. According to the German consulate, these acts of sabotage are in fact industrial accidents attributed by Roosevelt to the Nazis. 794. It's not surprising, then, that children of a tender age are sometimes frightened by the alarmist propaganda, unrelenting in announcing and depicting in the most awful terms possible the imminent invasion by the Nazi hordes. 795. Once the United States officially entered the war, the atmosphere becomes even more tense. The wartime pronouncements against spies and loose talk don't let up in their warnings, displaying the faces of youths who are soon to be orphans because of irresponsible chatter. Against the acts of sabotage, another pronouncement proclaims a new crime, that of the poor use of work instruments, and it shows the image of Mr. Toolwrecker, charged and put in jail by a police officer. 796. Obviously, this genuinely dangerous situation is combined with a deliberate distortion of reality. So concludes the American historian. We'll now turn to FDR. Well understood the value of national anxiety. FDR and his supporters went beyond the line that separates public concern from mass hysteria. 797. Before us are the fundamental elements of the terror that takes hold in Russia. Without a doubt, the phenomenon analyzed with regards to Britain and the United States appears in a monstrously enlarged form in Russia. But do ideology, paranoia and the objective situation play a decisive role? Besides the mutable yet incessant civil war, we have geopolitics to take into account. In April of 1947, with the Cold War already brewing on the horizon, in a conversation with the Republican candidate Harold Stassen, Stalin will highlight, with a kind of envy, the extraordinarily favorable geopolitical situation of the United States, protected by two oceans and with only Canada and Mexico to its north and south, two weak countries that certainly don't represent a threat. 798. Things are very different in Soviet Russia. One can ridicule Stalin's paranoia, but we have seen Goebbels speak of the great success of German espionage in France and its total failure in the USSR. Moreover, the first to insist on the penetration of a German fifth column in Russia are the very enemies of Bolshevism. In Kerensky's eyes, as demonstrated by the Brest-Litovsk capitulation and the signing of traitorous separate peace, the protagonists of October 1917 act in service to Wilhelm II, for which they are massively financed and aided. According to the Menshevik leader, the German secret services had already carried an important role in the pacifist agitation that had depleted the military strength of the country. 799. Churchill makes a similar argument, stressing the weight of German gold and the disorder in Russia. 800. In our time, going yet further back, an Israeli historian discovered the fingerprints of Imperial Germany, determined to weaken in any way possible the strength of its neighbor and rival, in Alexander III's premature death in 1894, who died because the medical team had applied the wrong treatment to him, as well as the 1911 assassination of Pyotr Stolypin, that happened with the involvement of some pro-German higher officials, and in the peculiar behavior of Nicholas II. 801. In any case, with regards to the collapse of the Tsarist regime, it's important not to lose sight of the effective German fifth column present in the Russian court and in the highest positions of the army, therefore at the very center of power. Indeed, in May of 1915, Moscow was the site of various pogroms against Germans. However, the German minority that occupied the highest levels of power were still intact. In conclusion, the historians who have given exclusive attention to revolutionary voluntarism or liberal maneuvers have ignored other evidence, from which one can deduce that the revolutionary movement could have been in part provoked by pro-German sectors or by a direct intervention by German espionage in conformity with a plan designed by Dr. Franzau. 802. Is the overview offered here plausible? Or is it also affected by the paranoia generally attributed to Stalin? In any case, one can start with an assumption: while it may have been weakened for some time, the defeat of the Second Reich doesn't eliminate the activity of its intelligence services within Russia, where, on the other hand, The dissolution of the old regime coincides with the reinforced presence at all levels of the great Western powers. Overall, it's enough to read any history of the Cold War to understand that the birthplace of the October Revolution was especially exposed to the danger not just of military invasion, but also infiltration and espionage. In the 1920s, thanks to the collaboration of Russian exiles, Britain was able to decode the Soviet Union's encrypted messages, which remains the principal target of their intelligence services even in the middle of the 1930s. Meanwhile, the Third Reich has emerged, which, in preparing its aggression, can count on the proven ability of Colonel Reinhard Gechlin, a master of intelligence, subversion and deception. Later, immediately after the defeat of Hitler's Germany, Allen Dulles demonstrates vision in putting at the service of the recently created CIA the very man who had played a great role in the German attack on Russia in 1941. 803 During the Cold War, aside from espionage, the activity of Western intelligence services also included sabotage operations and even support to insurrectionary movements. 804 More than 20 years after Stalin's death, this outlook hadn't changed. We can deduce this from an article in a prestigious American newspaper. The author is satisfied to report how a computer sabotage operation by the CIA resulted in an enormous explosion in Siberia, all of it organized with precision by an economist named Gus Weiss, and it helped the United States win the Cold War. 805 If we then keep in mind that the use of sabotage also has a particular Russian tradition behind it, we can arrive at a conclusion. To understand what happened in the Stalin years, rather than resort to a single paranoid personality as a deus ex machina, it would be better to follow the approach raised by an illustrious eyewitness who, in Moscow of 1937, speaks of unquestionable acts of sabotage, and at the same time of a psychosis of sabotage that arises out of that reality. 806